This is Beyond the Business, Weekly Digest.
This week, Davos happened. The panels are over, the headlines are out, and the official narrative is clear. Climate risk is now real. Resilience is now strategic. Infrastructure is now the priority. But what interests me most is not what was on the stage, but what was said the least. Because Davos is not where problems get discovered, it's where problems get packaged. So today I want to look at the blind spots and the things everyone circles around carefully but rarely touches directly. Not because they are unclear, but because they are inconvenient. And the first one is the easiest one to recognize. Let's move into climate adaptation because this is one of those concepts that sounds clear in the conference language but becomes much less clear once you look at how systems behave under real stress. In Davos, adaptation is usually framed as a rational next step: emissions reduction, infrastructure upgrades, preparedness, and resilience. The narrative suggests that the future is manageable if we keep improving the toolkit, but on the ground, adaptation often means something else. It becomes the default response once the baseline is already unstable. It's not a strategy you activate in time, it's a label that appears when prevention is no longer reliable and recovery is no longer guaranteed. And that distinction matters. Because adaptation is not just an engineering topic, it depends on institutional performance, whether protection actually works before the event, and whether recovery works after it. If either side fails, what follows is not adaptation in a meaningful sense, it's exposure followed by loss. I've seen the same pattern repeat in very different contexts. The situation isn't only about the events, it's about what happens after people have already paid into the system for years. Infrastructure budgets, emergency services, public administrations. The expectation is simple: when shock conditions arrive, the system absorbs part of the impact and helps restore the baseline. But in reality, failure happens in two stages. The first is the inability to prevent large scale loss, and the second is the inability to compensate that loss fast enough to stop long term damage from becoming permanent. And this is where Davos framing becomes uncomfortable, because adaptation is often described as a technical progress, like flood barriers and grid reinforcement, stress tests, digital monitoring, emergency coordination. All of that matters, but the core issue is not the toolset. It's whether institutions can still execute at the speed and scale the conditions now require. That's why resilience increasingly works as a narrative asset. It sounds constructive and it avoids direct confrontation with the harder question: what happens when climate volatility becomes normal, but recovery capacity does not scale with it? Because if repeated shocks become routine and support systems remain slow, underfunded, or fragmented, then adapting gradually turns into living with a permanent downgrade. And that's the real risk hidden inside the word adaptation. It's not only climate damage, it's systemic erosion, where society keeps financing stability in theory, but experiences less stability in practice. Right now, everyone keeps talking about insurance: business insurance, supply chain insurance, climate risk insurance, operational insurance. But if we stop for a sec and think about what insurance actually represents, the picture gets uncomfortable. Because risk used to be something you calculated after the fact. It was based on historical data, trends, old patterns, benchmarking, long averages. Insurance was reactive, a tool for rare shocks, not for normal life. But now it's changing. Insurance is no longer reacting to reality, it's starting to measure reality. And what's measuring is simple: It's telling us that the environment we operate is no longer stable. Because when risks expand to everything, that's not resilience, that's systemic stress. And when everything becomes high risk, it means the baseline has collapsed. And what's happening right now is that we are treating this as normal. We are talking about insurance like it's an adaptive solution, like it's a part of modern sustainability. But it isn't. Insurance is not a fix, it's an emergency tool. Its whole purpose was to help society recover from exceptional events. What we are doing now is different. We are using insurance to cover a preventive failure. We failed to protect system upfront, so now we are trying to financially wrap everything after the fact. And that only leads to one outcome. Soon we will be trying to insure almost everything we touch. Homes, ports, logistic corridors, power supply, production, food systems. But if insurance becomes the main climate strategy, then adaptation isn't adaptation anymore. It's a survival mode, delay mode, a system trying to stay operational while the pressure keeps rising. And the most dangerous part is how casually this is being discussed. Like it's normal, like it's a new standard. No, it's not a standard. It's proof that the system is already running under conditions it wasn't designed to survive. And the more we rely on insurance to replace prevention, the more we lock ourselves into a world where managing losses becomes the plan. Not stopping them, just the plan. So let's come back to the word that keeps being used as the global solution: decarbonisation. Because after climate damage, after insurance gaps, after recovery failures, this is usually presented as the next step: the fix, the plan, the direction. But at this point, decarbonization starts to look less like a strategy and more like a myth. Not because people don't care, technology doesn't exist, but because the physical room for clean breakthroughs is smaller than the narrative suggests. The periodic table is finite. Physics is finite. Chemistry is finite. We are not living in a world where you can invent a new element every decade and rebuild civilization around it. And in reality, there is no truly zero footprint energy source that scales globally without trade offs. Even the closest candidate, nuclear, still sits inside a wall of regulatory friction, public trust issues, and long cycle safety governance. It is discussed more openly now, but it's still not something the system can deploy at planetary speed. So, what is decarbonization today in practice? It's not a breakthrough, it's a retrofit, a rebranding of limited upgrades inside an old machine. We can improve fuels at the margins, we can optimize efficiency, we can shift some parts of the system to cleaner inputs. We can push biofuels, blends, offsets, certificates, new labels, but we cannot decarbonize our way out of a finite system. At some point, you hit the wall where the problem is no longer the fuel, it's the architecture that consumes it. And this is where the entire framework gets twisted. Because decarbonization is treated as if we can remove carbon from the elements, from the material world, from the energy itself. But decarbonization is not about decarbonizing molecules. It's about decarbonizing behavior. It's about decarbonizing processes, governance, design, limits, controls, enforcement. Not taxes that inflate the bill, but rules that reshape what is allowed and what is normal. If you want an actual decarbonization framework, it doesn't start with slogans. It starts with restrictions that force the system to change. If you produce high impact materials at scale, you face hard limits. If you operate heavy emissions processes, you face hard constraints. If you consume energy at extreme intensity, you don't just pay a higher price, you lose the ability to treat that consumption as default. Because the goal is not to make carbon cheaper to manage, the goal is to make wasteful emissions harder to generate. That's the part missing from most decarbonization talk today. Right now, the world keeps selling decarbonization as an upgrade, but upgrades don't change outcomes when the operating model stays the same. And until we stop treating decarbonization like a technological miracle and start treating it like a governance redesign, it will remain what it currently is, a powerful narrative with very limited structural effect. So let's move on and let's talk about supply chain and the weather. Weather is becoming a supply chain variable, and supply chains were never designed for that. For decades, delays were treated as exceptions, a storm here, a disruption there, and a seasonal inconvenience. But now the pattern is different. It's not rare event anymore, it's recurring condition. What we are watching is a shift from occasional disruption to structural instability, where the system has to operate inside growing uncertainty and not around it. And the uncomfortable part is that most of this is still underreported, especially in the way that consumers can actually feel it. Because delays are inconvenient to explain, they raise uncomfortable questions, they damage trust. So supply chains try to absorb them quietly until they can't. At some point, the delays stop being a logistic issue and it becomes something larger. Bottlenecks, port congestions, disrupted schedules, broken service reliability. And once that happens, it's not just shipping that slows down, it's inventories, production planning, fuel supply, spare parts, you name it. This isn't theory, we've seen the pattern repeating. Storm systems intensify, sea states become less predictable, windows for safe passage narrow. Whether it's the kind of winter disruption we have been seeing since late December 2025 or major weather events across different regions in 2023 or 2024, the same signal keeps returning. The mechanism is simple. Oceans are warming, they store more heat energy, the energy turns in instability. The bigger the contrast between sea temperature and air systems, the more violent the reaction becomes. Stronger winds, stronger storms, harsher operating limits. And the result is operational, not philosophical. A vessel doesn't move because the narrative says it should, it moves when the conditions allow it. So the chain starts accumulating delays, not because someone made a mistake, but because the environment itself becomes a constraint. And this is where the real blind spot appears. We keep speaking about climate as if it's mainly environmental storyline. But what it's actually doing is turning logistics into a friction economy. Every delay costs money, every reroute adds fuel consumption, every congestion point inflates price and risk. This is what people don't see. The climate signal shows up inside the supply chain first, long before it shows up in the policy. Then it spills into infrastructure. Coastal zones take the hit. Cities lose power, ports slow down, transport networks fracture. Homes get damaged, businesses shut down, people lose assets that took decades to build. And suddenly we are back to the first block we discussed. Because when impact becomes real, adaptation isn't a slogan anymore, it becomes the question of whether society is actually protected. And too often it isn't. Which brings us straight into the second block, insurance. Insurance is now being treated as if it's a normal layer of modern life. But what it really signals is that the system is trying to price instability instead of preventing it. People pay into the system, they fund public infrastructure, emergency response, resilience programs, and when the shock arrives, they still lose homes, business continuity, and financial stability. Then they are told no, insure more, pay more, and adapt again. That's the loop. We create the emissions, we create the volatility, We absorb the disruption and then we pay again to survive the consequences. So the paradox is not the climate is expensive. Okay, and then let's move on a little bit further. There was another narrative running through Davos that sounded optimistic on the surface. The World Economic Forum keeps talking about the jobs of the future: farmers, retail workers, delivery drivers, skilled technicians, people who keep daily life running. It's presented as a future skills discussion, a training problem, an education problem, and reskilling problem. But the real problem is not skills. The real problem is that climate risk is turning jobs into a fragile asset. Because work does not exist in a vacuum, work exists inside stable infrastructure, predictable logistics, functioning insurance, and basic continuity of everyday life. And all of that is now under pressure. When storms intensify, when floods reshape cities, when heat waves weaken grids, when supply chains become irregular, the impact doesn't stay at the level of inconvenience. It cuts directly into employment. Small businesses lose inventory, lose access, lose cash flow, and often disappear permanently. Local economies don't pause, they break. And when they break, the first thing that collapses is not a climate target, it's a payroll. This is the part nobody likes to state openly. Climate risk is not only an environmental issue, it's a direct business continuity threat. And that means job loss. Not in a symbolic way, it's the simplest possible way. If deliveries don't arrive, the store cannot operate. If the port is congested, productions stops. If infrastructure fails, services shut down. If insurance prices goes out of reach, recovery becomes impossible. That's why the jobs of the future narrative can feel strangely disconnected. It assumes the system will still be there to host those jobs. But in many places, we're already watching the opposite. The system is becoming less reliable, not more. So the workforce conversation needs a different frame because the job that matters most in the coming decade is not the most digital one. It's the job that remains functional when the operating environment turns hostile. And this is where the blind spot becomes obvious. You can't reskill your way out of broken supply chain. You can't train your way out of a collapsed insurance market, and you can't upskill your way out of a city that can't recover. This is not a workforce strategy issue, it's an operating conditions issue. And until that's unacknowledged directly, the future of works remains a clean narrative built on unstable ground. And that brings us to the real point. There are other topics that Davos barely touches, if it touches them at all. Not because they don't matter, but because they're inconvenient. They expose the zones where there are no clean answers, no wins, no simple roadmap, no headline friendly solution. They force an uncomfortable admission the system is not in control. And that's exactly why these questions don't get airtime. Because they are politically difficult, economically risky, publicly uncomfortable. It's easier to talk about progress, targets, resilience, and adaptation. It's harder to talk about the part that comes before all of that: the preventive failures, the recovery failures, the reality that insurance is becoming a substitute for stability. And here's the real problem: if global forums are meant to serve society, then society has to be informed honestly. Not with optimism, not with a polished language, and not with goals that sound good on paper, but with a clear acknowledgement of what is still unresolved, what is already breaking, and what the real trade offs are. Because trust doesn't come from promises, trust comes from transparency. If the hardest questions are avoided, people don't just lose confidence in the answers, they lose confidence in the entire platform. And once collective trust collapses, it becomes almost impossible to rebuild it through individual speeches, individual policies, or individual narratives. That's the blind spot behind the blind spots. We don't only have a climate problem, we have a credibility problem. And without credibility, even the best solutions arrive too late to be delivered.